Hey, what's up, comrades? So I just finished the Prince Lestat and the Kingdom of Atlantis. Yeah, I think so. Atlanto. So this is an interesting book. So it's like book number 13 in Anne Rice's like Vampire Chronicles. It started with Interview with a Vampire, which most older people at least are going to be familiar with because of the movie with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, which I watched the other day and I feel like kind of still holds up. I enjoyed it at least. So, um, what's going on with this guy here is that you can't really jump in this book series at any point. I mean, you kind of can. I feel like that doesn't harp too much, but there's so many references back to characters and relationships and stuff that if you don't have at least like a vague understanding, it's a lot of like very confusing stuff. And this at this point, we're almost at like the final book, and this is a few years before Anne Rice passed away. So we have Lestat, who, without going too much into his story, he's a French noble who gets turned into a vampire, and then he turns like his mom into a vampire, and they become lovers. And it's not so incestuous as it sounds, but Anne Rice, she definitely took the horror genre and mixed it very heavily with like the romance genre, and so you get a lot of horror elements, right? She's popularized vampires to a much greater extent than Twilight. Essentially, Twilight wouldn't have existed without Interview with a Vampire, in my personal opinion, because she could really like humanize them and gave them their own kind of like sex appeal kind of situation. But she did the same thing with like werewolves and ghosts and witches. There's like a whole world of darkness, and not like White Wolf's World of Darkness or CCCP or whoever owns the rights to all that crap now. Oh, mummies. Yeah. There's like a whole thing. There's a lot. Anyway, it's all very good. So, but in this series, so Lestat at this point has taken on the spirit of, I see it's like Amal or Amon. I'm going to go with Amon because I think that's what it is. This is like a book on tape that I listened to, so I'm not exactly sure how to spell it. And this Amon character came up kind of later in the series. Again, this is like book 13. So who is this? Well, when we start the book, he's a spirit that kind of made the vampires exist. And so the first vampire, Queen Akasha, from Queen of the Damned, which is also a movie that came out, so you might be familiar with her as well. She had the spirit which made vampires possible. And at some point, this other vampire, Merrick, I want to say, or no, it's another M name. Anyway, she like one of the other original vampire spirit ladies, she like killed Akasha and ate her brain and took on the spirit of Amon, and then she wanted to give it up, and so Lestat took it, and now Lestat is like the prince of the vampires, and he's trying to create like a society of vampires where they live in like if you're familiar with like Vampire the Masquerade at all, he's essentially trying to create that but like worldwide and more like in control, right? So the vampires, there's like lots of vampires that exist in little courts and stuff, similarly to Vampire the Masquerade, but at this point they're trying to like unify everybody. And there's the bad guy Roshimandias, and there's some like neutral parties, and there's tons of vampires, not more than like 1,000 per se in the whole world. But now that Amon and Lestat are like coexisting, Amon can like touch with any vampire, right, and can experience anything. There's also some ghosts that get involved. There's like a lot of stuff going on at the beginning. The first part of this book is kind of like boring, if you will. We're just kind of learning about Lestat and Amon's relationship because they combined like at the end of the last book. And we're also learning about Derek and some other creatures that aren't human but aren't vampires either. And we learn a lot about them later. Derek's kind of the main one to start. I can't remember their names. There's a woman that becomes the predominant character, and then there's another guy that like exists. And there's actually 4. And the fourth one, I don't think he even has dialogue really. And then there's like more stuff that goes on with that. So that's the main thrust of this book. So what is the realm of Atlantis? The realm of Atlantis, Lestat starts to have these dreams, and he talks to Amon about this beautiful city, right? Atlantis, essentially. And Amon's like, I can't remember, but I think it had something to do with me. Whenever we have these dreams, I get sad. And Lestat gets sad too, because they've kind of like merged almost into like a singular entity, still separate. And so he goes to like the Talamasca creator, who's a spirit. And the Talamasca is kind of like this scholarly organization that they're kind of tied into all these different kind of creatures and stuff. And they kind of keep track. They're like the Watchers from the original Highlander series from like the 1980s and 90s. It's like a little deep cuts. But that there's like a whole thing with that where they are kind of like separated from the original creation and just doing their own thing. And they essentially made a deal to like leave the vampires alone and stop bothering them. But one of the main Talamasca guys, I think he gets turned into a vampire by Lestat at some point, but they're kind of heavily involved with each other. I apologize, my son's in the back seat of this car. I was trying to record this when he was being more quiet, but he decided to start singing. Anyway, so we don't learn too much about that, but then we start to really heavily check in on Derek, and and then there's another creature that gets found, and he kills a vampire, and then oh wait, there's like Armand, and then Armand, not to be confused with Amon, he's from Interview with the Vampire. He's one of the kind of the vampire leader characters. He captures this other creature, and the creature's like super strong, and he's able to like bust free. And you know, when the vampires drink blood from these creatures, they get all these crazy visions of like all this stuff. And Derek is being held captive by this other vampire called Roland, and he's the one who shows him to Roshimandius. And Roshimandius is like a super old vampire, but him and Lestat came to like blows essentially, and he's been kind of like on the outs with like the mark of Cain is what they call it. So everyone like forsooks him and stuff, like out of the Bible. You know, everyone be like, oh, he's a vagabond. So this guy can't go anywhere without being kind of harassed by the vampire people who, you know, the vampire court, which consists of most of the vampires in the world at this point. Roland's like a neutral party. He's kept this like slave character because he can drink from him unlimited amount of times, and he never dies and whatever. Eventually, Roshimandius is trying to get information from him because the vampires have generally become aware of like these other creatures because of this death and Armand capturing him and then him escaping, and they learn that there's like more of them. And the vampires have this like radio where they send messages out to everybody so they can all keep track. Garrick, I think is what the other vampire's name is. Or not the other vampire, the other creature. There's Derek and Garrick. Something like that. And then the girl is like C. Anyway. And at the same time, the like science-y vampire Farouk, he discovers that so one of their head of the vampire kind of leadership, I can't remember what his name is. It's a lot. So he has like a pharmaceutical company, and there's like a woman who works for him, and then Farouk like discovers that she's like doing all this shady stuff, and he like asks about her and finds out she has like no past, and there's like a whole bunch of stuff like that. And so there's a whole lot of mystery, but eventually these like other creatures get to finally like hook up, and Derek frees himself by like he gets his arm cut off, and then while he's like asleep, his arm like creates like another person, and he gets his arm back, right? Which is bizarre. And so then with this other person, this like replica of him, this clone essentially, he's able to they free themselves, and then they meet up with all the other creatures, and then the vampire Lestat like council and these guys meet up together. And there's a whole thing where they're going to be like friends, but they want to like learn more about everything that's going on. And then the lady's like, let me tell you about Atlantis. And you get this like crazy story about like bird aliens who live on like this planet or this asteroid that travels through space. And that then we learn that Amon was like sent down to Earth to like initiate like a plague to destroy all the mammal-based like life forms because they're so hot-blooded and stuff. And that they send replinoids, which is what these other people are, which are like clone people made of this stuff called like Leastrium or something. It's so bizarre. To go down and like destroy this city, which is Dome City, which is like which is Atlantis. And that there's other tribes kind of meandering about. And then the replinoids come down and they like find like these shrines of like suffering all over the place. And then they also get into Atlantis, and eventually they meet up with Amon, and Amon's like, I've been tracking you this whole time, and like you're not the first. Like there's all these replinoids that like live in my palace now. And you find out that Amon's like used to be human. He was captured, and then he was ostracized from his tribe because he had red hair, and then he was taken to Ravenna, which is like the bird people's asteroid home, and they did a bunch of experiments on him, essentially made him immortal, and then sent him back to do a bunch of stuff. And he worked for him for a little bit, but then he decided, no, I'm human, I'm going to stick with the humans. And so he created this world and used the Leastrium to like create like a perfect society with like out war and they had like cell phones and all this other stuff because of the Leostrum, and then but it all just worked within like this city, and that he was trying to get rid of the suffering thing, because the suffering thing, if we discover plot twist, he didn't send the Replonoids down there to destroy necessarily. He just sent them down to cause problems, because these bird people get off on like the suffering of the mammal like people, and so they like are watching it somehow, and this all gets revealed through like various things, and it all makes sense. It's just kind of like there's nothing bad about it at all. Actually, it's not like anything. It's just kind of it's it's just like what the like this goes from like vampires, and there's like a spirit vampire that's like started all the vampire stuff, to like what bird aliens like what is happening. It's all good though. And it was super interesting, this whole like world that Anne concocted, this like space world and this whole other society and like all this like galactic stuff. It doesn't really go anywhere. And eventually like we learn all this stuff, and we learn more about Atlantis and how this Leostrum works, and the Replonoids and how their genetics are completely different, and all this crazy stuff. And then they're like, well, we don't want to destroy you. And we meet like other Replonoids that are like they're less advanced than the current batch, but they're still like around. But then like the Ravana in the sky, like this asteroid or whatever, it looks like it explodes, and all these fires come down, and it creates like an ice age on Earth and destroys the city of Atlantis, and like Amon gets killed, and this side becomes a spirit, and there's another Replonoid that gets killed, and I guess that's Memnoch, which that's a whole nother bag of worms, but essentially it's another spirit, and there's a whole book based on him, which is excellent as well. And that's like the end of it, right? And then we learn that the Replonoids now, led by this woman, are gonna do their own thing. They want to be like friends, but they don't want to. They want to like exist in their own colony, and they're like creating more of themselves by cutting their limbs off, and like that's a whole thing. And then it doesn't sit well with Lestat and Amon and some other people. They're like, well, there seems to be more going on here than like meets the eye, and there's some like secretive back and forth. And so what we find out is that the lady wants to build a Replonoid body for Amon, so that he can exist again. And the problem with that is that the idea is that they have to have Amon to be vampires, because if like Lestat dies and Amon goes away, all the vampires are going to die as well. Because anytime Lestat gets like injured, or he's like out in the sun for too long, it like hurts all the other vampires. Or if he burns himself, everyone feels the burn because of the spirit Amon. So that seems like there's like some really down times for like a chapter. And then like Louis shows up, and Louis is like Lestat's super homie, / lover sometimes, and he's the main character of Interview with the Vampire, right? So he rolls in, and he's like, hey, so I think there's like a tie that we can sever with Amon, and it's not going to kill anybody. And Lestat's like, why do you think that? And he's like, because it happened to me, because I went out to kill myself at some point, and I died, but then like I came back to life because you guys like resuscitated me, and I've not had any ties to any of this stuff. Like when you're suffering, or when things are going on and the whole vampire society is causing problems, I don't feel anything. And we also, it's hinted at this before, that Amon cannot enter Louis. And Lestat just kind of, Amon kind of reveals this earlier in the book, Lestat's kind of like, whatever, you're a liar sometimes, I'm not going to listen to you, you're just being dramatic. But it's like, no, he cannot. And so then they do an experiment with Farouk, and he like kills himself, and then they bring him back. And then now he's severed, but he's still alive, and he's still a vampire and all this stuff. And so what they do is they get Lestat, and they like kill him and resuscitate him, and that severs like all the connections to all the vampires in the world. So now all the vampires are separate, and they can do their own thing. But still, it's like, well, the Replonoids are gonna get Amon out of Lestat, and that might kill him. And there's some back and forth with that. And then there's like a crazy like battle scene sorta, where Lestat gets like kidnapped pretty much, and then they're able to like get Amon out of him, and he doesn't die. Lestat doesn't die, and then everyone's like super happy, and it's like victory. Everyone got what they wanted. But Lestat's still kind of sad because he misses Amon. He doesn't know if the transfer worked and all this stuff. But then he bumps into him in like New Orleans, right, where they're having like beignets. I love this book series. And they like, oh, I missed you, blah 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 blah, all this stuff. And it's like, oh, good times, happy ending, and that's that. The slice of life just kind of keeps going. Anyway, but. It was super interesting. Again, it starts really slow and kind of like drags a little bit, but then it kind of picks up there in the middle when the Replonoids really start taking the forefront, and the stuff about Atlantis was great. And then it kind of doesn't rush through the ending, but it's very quick paced, and it's very exciting, and like there's a lot of fun stuff going on at the end. So I thoroughly enjoyed There's one more called the Blood Communion, so we'll see where that goes, and that's like the last Vampire Chronicle book. So we'll see how that wraps up. But I'm kind of like, I guess there's Roshi Man to this still, who's like sitting around the background being like a douche nozzle, or maybe more stuff with the Reploids. I almost feel like we're gonna move on from that, but we'll see. Because Anne Rice doesn't tend to like stick with. It's like this book was with the Reploid book. Moving on. Oh, this is the book with Memnock. Moving on. This is the book where Lestat like gets his body. He becomes a human for a little bit. Moving on. Like we come back to characters, and characters will come back and do stuff, but it's like we're not going to like dwell on this Reploid thing anymore. It's just going to be like a thing that exists, which I like, which is good. And then, yeah, so that's that. Cool. Catch y'all later.